Hi, I'm Elizabeth Christensen from Crunchy Data. I'm from Lawrence, Kansas, and I'm going to talk about open source Postgres and how code gets into the Postgres codebase. And if you wanted to put a patch in, the process of submitting patches. So I'm from Crunchy Data, and we do Postgres on managed cloud, in Kubernetes, and self-hosted. I'm on the board of the United States PostgreSQL Association, and we do a lot of education and events. And I also host a meetup near my house in Kansas City. If you're ever in town, we'd love to have you. And I also help host the PostgUS Day event. If you're interested in geospatial data, it's a super fun remote all-day event in November. So I'm here to talk about the process of getting patches into Postgres, and I was lucky enough to get my first patch in recently, and this is a little snippet from the patch that I actually got in. And this is what my patch looks like. It's a documentation patch, and it went into the hot updates documentation page. So a little bit about why I wanted to submit a patch and kind of why I'm passionate about talking to you guys about open source contributions. So I think that documentation is really important. I write a lot of documentation at my day job at Crunchy, and I think that docs are important for helping new people come into the software, kind of making things accessible. And the Postgres docs are sort of well regarded in the open source community. They're very good. They're very thorough. They're a very good reference manual. They don't have tons of examples. They don't have tons of tutorials, and there's kind of other things that can be built out. And so there's some opportunities in kind of the Postgres docs, right? Things where things might be unclear, or you might need to connect, one update to some other piece of documentation. So that's kind of where the patch that I submitted comes into play. So another thing that's important to me is that the Postgres is a really diverse ecosystem of lots of different kinds of people, right? So for Postgres to continue to be the go-to open source database in the future, we need architects and data scientists and people that are building products and DBAs, and we need lots of different perspectives to make the whole ecosystem really healthy. And that's true for the code base, the documentation, and all of the events and other community things happening with Postgres. So let's talk a little bit about just the code base and kind of how the whole thing works. And then I will kind of, after we go through that, I'll explain how you can kind of get into that yourself. So the Postgres code base itself is kind of, I made a little version calendar. This is something I update sort of regularly for myself just to kind of keep track of where everything is. So I'm recording this at the very end of May, and you'll see this in June. And Postgres 17 was just released in public beta today. And so as soon as Postgres 17 is in public beta, Postgres 18 is open for commits. And so the next commit fest that happens and the next things that go in will be in Postgres 18. We're currently on Postgres 16 in production. That was released in the fall. And there was just Postgres 16.3 that came out as a minor point version. So the Postgres release team is doing a great job of releasing a new version of Postgres every fall and then doing several minor point versions kind of as the year goes on. The actual Postgres code is in a couple places. One is in GitHub, and you can see this link, and the other one is in a Git URL. Both of these places will let you pull down the Postgres code and the docs. And if you do that and pull in the code to your local machine, you can see the docs, and they're sort of done in a kind of special format, and you'll see a little HTML stuff for those files. I thought this was kind of cool. One of my very first jobs in tech was tagging HTML, so I felt really at home when I saw this. And if you get into the other code that kind of runs the database itself, you'll see that that's all C code, and you can open up those individual files and see kind of what's actually under the hood and running the whole Postgres database. The actual code store that the project uses is at the Git URL. And that is kind of where everything is. And then there is a certain group of people, the committers, that can actually push new code into that Git repository. So committers are people that have been a part of the Postgres code base for a long time. They've had several patches. They're sort of known and trusted individuals, and they can get your code in. So, and when you're talking about the sort of Postgres code and how things get in and kind of get actually released and into the hands of users, the committers are the people that will commit the code. And then there's a release management team that will, they will sort of coordinate the releases, decide which pieces go in which minor point versions, which pieces go in the bigger versions. And there's a lot of work going on there. And then there's also the Postgres core team, and that group does a lot of communication about new releases and sort of overarching decisions about kind of how the whole project itself is going to work. So the sort of big picture release process here is that you've got new code coming in, something's happening with that. You've got committers that commit it. You've got a release management team that kind of plans a release. And then you've got a packaging team, and they sort of get everything ready, running on the operating systems that are supported by Postgres. And then the core team will sort of coordinate an announcement. So all of these people are obviously amazing, and it's incredible the amount of work that goes into these release processes. So let's talk a little bit about getting your own ideas and your own code into Postgres. So the first kind of place that you're going to be starting is with an idea, right? And so for a lot of people, this is going to be something that you've had a problem with. Documentation is a common place where people start committing to a project like this because you're probably a user. You've probably looked for something that you couldn't find. And there's a Postgres wiki with a to-do list. I'm not sure how up-to-date that is, and I'm not sure if people pick stuff off of that or what. It seems like there's a lot of older things on there. But the big thing to sort of take away from, patch ideas is just talking to people in Postgres. So my patch that I got in came up after a conversation that I had about some research and work I was doing with hot updates, and I kind of realized there were a few missing pieces, and there was some things that weren't clear, specifically about how the Brin indexing works with hot updates. So those conversations are going to be really important, right? You're probably not going to just have a patch idea, put that patch straight into Postgres. You're probably going to go through some iterations and conversations. So the sort of big picture Postgres patch process, which I'm going to go through kind of step by step here over the next couple minutes, is sort of your idea, lots and lots of discussion about your idea, how that could be implemented, the best way to implement it. And then there'll be, obviously writing the code and testing and sort of the rest of the process. So once you have an idea and you're ready to sort of experiment and see if you can get some development going to write some code to put into Postgres, you'll need to build Postgres locally. This is a little, depending on your setup, can be a little bit of a challenge. There's some good docs as part of the Postgres docs themselves. And there's two kind of build systems that Postgres is currently using. One is the Make build system, and then one is the Meson build system. I'm pretty sure that kind of the way that they want to go is towards the Meson build system, and that worked really well for me on my Mac. So those are the kind of steps I'm going to show you. So if you're gonna want to run the Postgres docs themselves, you'll need to be running a project called DocBook as well. And that's kind of the thing that makes all the docs work. And it also makes the docs go into a PDF, but it's sort of foundational to getting the docs actually running. You'll run the Meson and you'll do a setup and it'll kind of build stuff for you. And then you'll get into the Ninja, which is part of the build system. And so these two pieces, the Meson and the Ninja, will help you start up whatever piece that you want to run. So if you're going to do a Ninja build of the docs, you'll tell your system to Ninja build the docs, and then you'll be in the docs locally, right? So you'll be just running a local copy of the docs, and you can edit your edit those HTML files that I showed you before, and then you can kind of preview your changes and see how everything looks. If you're wanting to build the actual Postgres database itself, you'll also use this Meson and this Ninja build system, and you'll run a test, and then you'll create a directory for whatever version you're building. You'll initialize the database, and then you'll just pSQL straight into that local copy of the database. So very similar process, and that's kind of how you can build whatever copy of development Postgres is running, and you can go ahead and kind of test that out and actually use that database if you wanted to. So once you've got, your idea, you've put a little code in, you'll need to do some testing. Postgres comes sort of pre-packaged, these build systems with their own regression tests. And that's what you'll run when you run that Ninja test program. Those are pretty robust. There's a lot of stuff built into those regression tests, and depending on kind of what you've put into the code base, those regression tests might take a while to run. And other people are going to also probably run regression tests on your code. So we'll talk a little bit about that too when we get to some of the next steps. When you're kind of going through this process of testing your code, thinking about what you want, you'll want to pay pretty close attention to the Postgres coding conventions. There's lots of notes available on a wiki about submitting a patch. The other thing to keep in mind is that, Postgres is a 30-year-old project, and it has a lot of history and kind of, there's ways that things are done. There's kind of specific ways that things are talked about if you're using the docs and if you're coding. And so definitely you want to kind of follow the existing conventions, right? You're going to want to look at how things actually have been done in the past and kind of work with that. This is not a brand new open source project where you're going to be able to kind of come up with a bunch of your own new stuff and kind of rock the boat, right? This is not that project. This is a very stable project, and you'll kind of want to look at how things are done and then kind of make your things kind of work within that system. So let's say that you've got your idea, you've got your code, you've run your regression tests, and you're pretty happy with how everything looks. The next step is to kind of get this in a patch, right? So this is going to be the actual thing that gets submitted to the Postgres community, and the Postgres community is going to kind of review and decide if they want to implement. So a patch process is different from like a pull request system. I have only ever worked in a pull request workflow. I've never worked in a patch workflow before. So this was kind of new to me. I'm, used to just projects where, okay, I have something I want. I'm going to open a pull request and, it'll wait in a queue and hopefully somebody will review it. But the patch process is a little different. And that's where you'll use, Git, and you'll create a patch file. And that patch file just gets passed around, right? And that patch file will get passed around to a reviewer or a committer. And you can pull in patch files. You'll, create a new branch, and then you'll pull in a patch file and test that against the development version of Postgres. So to make a patch file, you'll just use Git, and you'll tell it, that you want to create a patch file. And it'll look something like this. So it'll have a long name. It'll be .patch. There'll be a large header at the top, and it'll kind of tell you some of the metadata about what's in it. And then it's kind of a diff file that follows there. You'll want to kind of look at how other people have formatted the header piece of the patch file. You can just edit this directly, like after you've created your patch file, if you want it to look a specific way. But this is a good way to kind of sort of in that coding conventions conversation, right? Making things look like other things have looked in the past. Take a look at that header. And so if you're, once you submit this patch, you'll literally submit this file, And then if you're doing a review or doing stuff for other people, this patch file is what you would pull in to test in a development version of Postgres. So Postgres works, the community and sort of the code base itself works with mailing lists. There's quite a few mailing lists for lots of different things. I think there's a couple dozen mailing lists. I am not on a ton of them. I'm on the docs mailing list, mostly because I'm kind of interested in what's happening with docs. If you're a beginner, the novice mailing list is a good place to start. It's got kind of beginner questions. The general mailing list is also just kind of general questions, things that are going on. And then the hackers list is kind of, that's where all of the patch file discussions and like the big picture kind of coding stuff is happening, right? And I'm not on the hackers list because I'm not involved in a lot of coding discussions, and I don't plan to be involved in Postgres at that level anytime soon. If you are like me and you're like not wanting to get thousands of emails a day about like underlying Postgres code, all the archives and kind of all of the mailing lists are online, which is super cool and helpful. So if you start a thread, it'll kind of be there, and then it'll be sort of hyperlinked, and you can see kind of the whole thread of what's happened in that particular discussion. And so every day the mailing lists are archived, and like if there's things going on that I have, or things that I'm kind of interested in, like if somebody I know has a patch, or there's a feature that I'm kind of watching to see what happens with, you can just kind of find that or bookmark that particular discussion. And then that way you don't have to like wait for emails. You can just find it when you're curious about it. And so, yeah, each of these threads has kind of its own URL, and you'll kind of see, sort of the whole history of what's happened. And for my particular case, you can submit to the hackers list, even if you're not actually reading it. So you can put sort of patches into the hackers list, and then because they reply all, you'll get emails back about your patch. And then you could also, if you wanted to check on the URL, you could do that too. So the hackers list is definitely not for new people. It's definitely not a place you want to hang out if you're trying to understand what's going on in Postgres. I definitely recommend kind of working with somebody that's, more familiar with patches and more familiar with the code process. I was really lucky. One of my coworkers, Stephen Frost, who has been contributing to Postgres for a long time, kind of helped me through my first patch process. So definitely, if you can find someone that can kind of help you sort of make sure that all your stuff is right and that you're saying the right things, that's definitely helpful. So to get your patch submitted, you'll email that patch file to the hackers list. And then there's a second step, which is adding your patch to a commit fest. So Postgres, like kind of the way that they decided, since this is a mailing list and there's lots of stuff happening, they have these periodic sort of commit fests, which are basically, a commit fest is just a list of things that could potentially go into the code base, things that have been submitted, and then who's reviewing those and what the status is. So this is sort of another way that they're trying to make sure that, patches and, contributions don't get lost. So if you go in to the commit fest URL, you'll see there's a whole list of commit fests from the past, and then there'll be one commit fest that's open. And so that'll be kind of right now, I think the June commit fest is open. Some new things can go in there. And then if it's brand new, you'll just put it there, and then it'll have it'll be waiting for review. Your name will be there, and it probably won't have a reviewer. But as things kind of get reviewed, you might have one of the contributors or one of the major contributors or, someone involved in the project add themselves as a reviewer. And then, if a committer is going to look at your project and potentially get it committed, they'll be listed there too. The commit fest log is kind of an interesting place, since I don't kind of keep up with the email, and the email thing is like too much for me. The commit fest lists are kind of a fun place to see like what's happening, right? Like who has what patches in and where they're at. So, if you're interested in what's going on in future versions of Postgres, that's kind of a cool place to look. Okay, so we've gotten as far as getting our patch submitted, and sort of the next step that happens is that a review will happen, right? So hopefully someone in the Postgres community is going to look at your patch and see what's going on and review it. They're going to look at it for coding conventions, those kind of things we talked about before. They'll look at the unit testing and regression tests, and Postgres has incredibly high standards. This is not a project where things easily make it in and you'll submit a patch file and it'll be committed the next day. This is a project that has incredibly high standards, a long history of stability. It's used across the globe by, Fortune 100 companies and banks. And so anything going into the code base just, has to have a lot of eyeballs, and it has to be very, very reviewed at a very high level. So just a couple tips. If this is your first time submitting or you're thinking about submitting, be prepared for tons of feedback. I am used to having pull requests reviewed pretty extensively, and Postgres is kind of another level, right? Like it's very, like even in the documentation, there will be a lot of discussion about even just the grammar and the wording and how things are linked together. And so, it's best to kind of just let the sort of discussion happen, right? And not take things personally, and not sort of, this is not a hill you want to die on if this is your first Postgres patch, right? This is a learning experience for you to kind of learn how the Postgres code base works and sort of how people think. And so that's a better sort of mentality if you can go into it with that. And then, this goes for every time any of your work is reviewed in tech, but, it's hard to not take things personally, especially if they're things that you wrote or you're passionate about. But nobody in Postgres means it personally, and they really just want this to be the most correct. And, they're really going for accuracy and technical competence. And be patient. Some of the patches take quite a while to actually get into the code base. And it can be tricky to find a reviewer, and then it can be even trickier to actually find a committer that has time to review it and put your commit in. And so, it can be a long process. So yeah, let's assume that everything goes the way that you wanted, and you kind of waded through this review process, and you sort of, in my case, there were several ideas about kind of updates to the documentation, which I was happy to have input on. And then a committer sort of picked up the patch and said, all right, if we're all in agreement, I'll commit this. And so once you get a commit, it's sort of in, right? Of the recent commit fest, I just kind of took a look at sort of what had happened. And, there's in any commit fest, there's, 300 or so, north of 300 patches submitted. Some of these are bigger features, so the numbers are a little bit trickier. And about 26% of things are getting committed, right? And so there's a whole bunch of stuff that's got feedback, a whole bunch of stuff that's moving to a future commit fest. Because it's not something they had time to deal with. But very few things are rejected outright. So if you see I was kind of encouraged to see that most things are sort of returned with feedback, or they're moved on to the future, which kind of means that they're not dead, but, they may need some work. But, 26%. So if you don't get your first patch submitted or your first couple patches submitted, you're probably in pretty good company. So what happens next? After you get your patch submitted, is it just goes straight into that Git mirror, right? And so it'll be there, and then other people who are developing on. So if you put a patch in and it goes into Postgres 18, anybody then who pulls Postgres 18 down will be able to test the things that you've put in there. And then everything is kind of packaged, and, we talked about that packaging and release process before. So, and then the docs, the actual Postgres docs that appear in the Postgres docs URL are updated every minor release. So if you do something for a future version, it'll be up there in that next version. Or if you do something that's like back patched to an existing production version of Postgres, just the next time a minor release happens, your docs will be up there. So if you're looking to kind of do more and dip your toe into actually contributing to Postgres, I think there's a lot of great resources. Sort of the Slack is really good. If you're not talking to people on Slack, there's a lot of good discussions on there. The local meetups are great. You'd be surprised how much cool stuff happens at local meetups and interesting people like coming in and out. The Postgres Conf New York conference, that'll be in the end of September, I think, beginning of October. Usually it's in the fall. A lot of the major contributors will be there. There'll be several committers there. So if you're kind of shopping around patch ideas, that's a good place to start. There's an annual event in Chicago every year happening in the spring. And that's always a fun place. And then the Postgres Association PgUS is also a great resource. We have a lot of events, and we would love to have you as a member. It's $25 a year. And thank you so much for your time today. I had fun putting this together, and I look forward to chatting with some of you. And if you'd like to find me on some kind of social media, I am SQL Liz.